Well, I had the ability to click the button without asking you, so there you go. I'm the authority. Okay. Yeah. All right. It's not recording yet. It'll be done in just a second. Okay. I will post this in your Canvas section so that you can go over this. All right. So this is the bird's eye view of the narrative or the Epic of Gilgamesh. Where we started together, we looked at the very beginning of the text, like the first couple of pages of it, and we realized very early on that Gilgamesh feels that Gilgamesh is very important, right? He's powerful. He's a king, right? And he's tyrannical in the sense that the people of Uruk, which is the kingdom that he built, they've been appealing to the gods for deliverance from Gilgamesh, right? So the subjects of his kingdom, they can't do anything about him, and so they appeal to their gods for intervention. And the gods in their infinite wisdom come together and they decide that the best way to contradict Gilgamesh's power is to provide a suitable opponent for him, right? So out of clay and water, the god Aruru creates a man named Enkidu, right? Now he creates Enkidu and he places him in the forest, right, in the wilderness. And Enkidu grows up around or lives around animals. He's the epitome of someone like living off the grid and being one with nature. He's never been to a city. He's never gone anywhere. He has not had any human interaction at all, right?
How do you spell Enkidu?
Say it again.
How do you spell Enkidu?
Enkidu. 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 Right? So as Enkidu is out in the wilderness living his happy animal, very nature-y life, there's a person from Uruk who goes to the wilderness to make a living, and it's a trapper. Right, so the trapper's job or kind of way of living is to go into the wilderness, go into the forest, and to set traps to catch animals, to skin them, to sell their hides and meat and all of this stuff. So this trapper is kind of this bridge between nature and civilization, right? Because he's going back and forth between the woods and Uruk. And what he notices is that his traps are being destroyed. Right, and he's a professional trapper, so that's not easy for animals to do. And so he waits and he hides to see what is destroying his traps, and he finds Enkidu. Right, so Enkidu and his commentary about Enkidu to his father and ultimately to Gilgamesh is that this is the strongest man in the world. Right, so the trapper is very intimidated. He's like kind of awestruck by the raw and powerful strength of Enkidu, right? And they decide the way to capture Enkidu is to be able to separate him from nature, and both his father and then also Gilgamesh give him this idea that the only way to separate him from nature is for Enkidu to be tempted and to have sex with a woman, right? And so for some reason, that's what they come up with, right? And so they create this plot, and the trapper takes a temple prostitute, right? Ishtar, the goddess of love, has prostitutes in her temples, and people can go worship her by having sex with temple prostitutes and paying money for that. So they take a temple prostitute out into the wilderness, and they pay her to tempt and seduce Enkidu. This works, right? So he sleeps with the temple prostitute, and the animals and nature reject him, right? In the sense where he's rejected by nature, he loses some element or degree of strength, and he's then brought to Uruk, right? Now, Gilgamesh didn't go out in the forest and do this. So Enkidu's walking around a city, which he's never seen before. And he stops in the path of this other very powerful man who happens to be Gilgamesh. Now, one thing that people don't do is if a king is walking towards you and you don't move out of the way, well, that's kind of disrespectful, right? So Enkidu sees Gilgamesh. They immediately recognize each other from dreams that they're both having. And Enkidu refuses to move out of Gilgamesh's way, right? It just stands right there, won't let Gilgamesh pass, right? And that kind of irritates Gilgamesh. And he's like, you know what, bro? You're not going to move? Let's fight, right? So they wrestle because neither one would move. And Gilgamesh ends up beating Enkidu, right? But it's such a contested match, right? That even when Gilgamesh beats him, he's like, bro, you're like totally strong, right? Like they have this moment after the wrestling match where all of a sudden they're buddies, right? He's like, you're my best friend. He's like, I've met the person who's like me, right? And so from that moment where Gilgamesh beats him in the match, they're like inseparable, right? They're like bros over everything, right? Like they hang out together, they eat together, they party together. Enkidu's living the civilized life like he's never had access. I mean, it's blowing his mind, right? But Gilgamesh has a dream. And the thing about Enkidu is that he's a dream interpreter. He's very in tune with like the spiritual, right? And so Gilgamesh has this dream, and Enkidu interprets it. And the conclusion that Gilgamesh comes to is that, man, I have not made a name for myself, right? Like I've not made a name for myself. Like I have only lived and been in Uruk. I've never really ventured outside of it. I haven't done anything with my life. I don't have a purpose. Let's go. Let's go on a journey, right? And the way that he wants to make a name for himself is that he wants to go. He wants to journey to a place called the Land of Cedars, right? And there is a giant, literally a giant, created and blessed by the gods, who protects this area, right? So the Land of Cedars is protected by this giant named Humbaba, right? And Humbaba is extremely formidable, right? Like he's a giant, right? He's very skilled at hand-to-hand combat and weaponry and stuff like that. Well, anyways, they go to the Land of Cedars for the purpose of killing the giant, right? And they end up doing that even as the giant is begging for forgiveness in front of them. Enkidu is the one who deals the killing blow, right? And so that, again, solidifies in Gilgamesh's mind the power and strength of this person who was created to be his opponent, but has now become like a brother to him. Right? On their journey, one of the other things that they come across is they come across the goddess Ishtar, right? So Ishtar is the goddess of love, right? And a goddess maybe wants what she wants and generally gets it. And she proposes marriage to Gilgamesh, right? Keep in mind that he's 2/3 God, 1/3 man at this point, right? And this moment in the text is very significant. And since you're taking notes, I want to repeat that this moment in the text is very significant, right? She proposes to Gilgamesh. She proposes marriage, right? And he thinks about it and he goes, nah, I'm good. I got my bro Enkidu. I'm good. I don't want to marry you. And she loses her Ishtar. Get it? No? Okay. Right? So she like loses it, right? And Gilgamesh, the reason why he rejects Ishtar is that Ishtar has this reputation for falling in love with people and then turning on them and turning them into animals, right? And Gilgamesh is like, I'm good. But what's significant about this is really that Gilgamesh recognizes the abuse, the manipulation, and like the Ishtar is kind of like Gilgamesh, right? That he rejects people who are not useful to him, right? He's so self-absorbed and conceited that that if it doesn't benefit him, he's not interested in it, right? Well, apparently this relationship with Enkidu is starting to kind of slowly change his perspective and worldview on himself and the world around him. He rejects Ishtar, and man, she is pissed. And like any Karen who gets pissed, she calls her dad, right? Aru, right? Or Anu, right? So she tattles on Gilgamesh for his rejection to her daddy, right? Her god daddy, right? Daddy god, right? Or whatever. And she claims that if her dad doesn't release the wild bull of heaven on Gilgamesh and Enkidu for their disrespectful rejection of her advance toward marriage, that she's going to smash the gates of hell and unleash the undead, right? Or unleash the dead, right? So zombie apocalypse if this girl doesn't satisfy her thirst, right? I mean, especially goddesses, right? But Gilgamesh is too, right? Like Gilgamesh is like, I mean, we'll get to that. All right. So her daddy god, Anu, has no choice but to unleash the wild bull of heaven upon the kingdom of Aru, right? Which he does, right? Because he doesn't want his daughter to smash the gates of hell and release the dead. Nobody wants that, really. But the wild bull of heaven enters Uruk and just starts destroying everything. People, buildings, like all this stuff that Gilgamesh has worked so hard to build, or at least enslaved people so hard to build on his behalf, right? If we're being a little bit more accurate here, right? Like, so the wild bull of heaven is releasing havoc upon Uruk, right? And Gilgamesh and Enkidu are like these, I imagine at this point, they're like these Power Rangers who are like putting their rings together and they're like, ah! Right? And so they kill the wild bull of heaven, right? Now, Humbaba, the giant in the land of Cedars, and the wild bull of heaven are supposed to be impossible to defeat, right? Like the gods have these two creatures in their pocket to protect and to destroy. And Gilgamesh and Enkidu have both nixed both of them, right? And so the gods, the way that it happens is that after Gilgamesh and Enkidu defeat the wild bull of heaven, right? There's rest and there's a little bit of drinking and celebration, as it were, and Enkidu has a dream. Right, and Enkidu's dreams are always significant, right? They always have meaning and they're always connected to the narrative, right? Enkidu has this dream that the gods are around a table, or that the gods are kind of circled together, and they're coming to the conclusion that the world cannot contain both Gilgamesh and Enkidu, right? And that one of them has to die, right? And so as Enkidu wakes up, and as you know, after a couple days, what ends up happening is that Enkidu becomes ill, right? So he starts getting sick. There's not really anything that can be done. They tried, the doctors and the shamans and all the people that they think can heal him, but he dies, right? He did. And this is the first time that Gilgamesh experiences loss, right? Gilgamesh to this point has never lost anything, right? Nothing. Everything for his entire life has always gone his way. He's gotten what he wanted. He didn't get what he didn't want. And then all of a sudden, he builds a relationship almost beyond like friendship to brotherhood with this Enkidu, who the gods created to be his foremost opponent and to humble him. And what ends up happening is the way that Gilgamesh gets humbled is that Enkidu gets sacrificed, right? So the gods decide to remove Enkidu by making him ill, right? Because the world's not big enough for the both of them, at least according to the gods, right? And so Enkidu dies, and that death marks a shift in Gilgamesh's in his mind, right? In his perspective and worldview, right? Specifically as it relates to him thinking about himself, right? So the people of Uruk have started, like, they've grown close and they've grown a deep appreciation for, you know, King Gilgamesh's new friend Enkidu, right? Gilgamesh and the people of Uruk are like, they're mourning for days, right? And the response that Gilgamesh has, right? So this is where we start to understand that Gilgamesh is strong, but Gilgamesh not smart. Gilgamesh's response to the death of Enkidu is that he believes that the only way for him to then move forward is to find immortality. All right, so just like many of you a little bit ago indicated that you would not want to live forever because everybody around you would die, Gilgamesh experiences a tremendous and very heartbreaking loss and decides that he would like to live forever. Right, which, you know, from our mind doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, right? Why would you continue to subject yourself to this, right? Okay, so there's a legend in the Mesopotamian culture that Gilgamesh is a part of, that there once was a god in Lil who became very tired of the noise of humanity, right? As a parent with children, I can totally get this, right? So Enlil creates a giant flood, right? He creates a giant flood to rid the earth of humanity, right? And there's one man, Utnapishtim, and his family, his wife, his children, carpenters. He builds a boat, a giant boat, an ark, if you will, right? And puts his family and these people who are very close to him on it, and the people who helped him construct the boat, along with a whole bunch of animals, right? And they are on this boat while the flood is raging across the earth, right? And Utnapishtim lands eventually on what becomes an island where he makes his home, right? As a way to make it up to Utnapishtim for their buddy Enlil destroying the earth, the rest of the gods bestow immortality on Utnapishtim, right? Gilgamesh knows this, and so his idea is that he's going to go across the sea, right? And he's going to find this Utnapishtim, and he's going to get the secret of immortality from him, right? From Utnapishtim, right? And one of the things that he's got to do in order to get there is that he's got to do a couple impossible tasks, right? So the first one is that Gilgamesh has to go across a mountain range that literally no person has ever crossed, right? There's even a reference to this in the very beginning of the text, right? He treads mountains, or I think is what the phrase is. But anyways, he crosses this mountain range that no other person has crossed, right? And he arrives at a place called the Garden of the Gods, right? Well, the Garden of the Gods is a place that's separated from civilization, right? And it's on the edge of the sea, right? And the Garden of the Gods has a character there named Cedars, right? And Gilgamesh gets to him and says to Cedars, "I'm going to go across the ocean and I'm going to become immortal." And Cedars is like, "No, you're not." Right? He's like, "Oh yeah, I am. I do impossible things. You haven't heard of Gilgamesh?" And Cedars is like, "Yeah, bro. Okay, whatever. Like, I don't really care. You're not going." Right? And Gilgamesh is looking for Urshanabi, who's the ferry boat person, right? To take him across the sea. Right? He finds Urnashabi, and Urnashabi goes, Yeah, no, I'm not taking you across the sea. You're like, who's found Utnapishtim, right? And Gilgamesh is going like, oh, I'm going to do it, bro. So you better put me on your boat and take me, right? And he's like, no, I'm not going to do that. Well, Gilgamesh gets a little angry, throws a little tantrum, and destroys this man's boat, right? So now definitely you're not going, you idiot. You just smashed the only thing that could take you there, right? And Ernest like, God, dummy. You're strong, but you're not smart, are you? And he's like, okay. You know what? You build me a better boat, and I'll take you. And Gilgamesh is like, say no more. And then gets like 120 logs and like under his guidance constructs this boat. All right. So Ernest takes Gilgamesh across the sea, right, to the island where Utnapishtim is living in immortality, right? So once Gilgamesh is there, he talks to Utnapishtim and he's like, he talks to the ferry boat guy. And he's like, hey man, just stay here. I'm gonna need to get back, so I won't smash your boat. Just hang out. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh that he'll give him the secret to immortality if he will stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights. Gilgamesh is like, really? That's it? Okay, right? So he believes that he stays awake for 6 days and 7 nights. But what he doesn't know is that Utnapishtim has put a fresh loaf of bread next to him every day, right? And so each day, the bread progressively gets moldier, right? And so it's in this way that Utnapishtim proves to Gilgamesh that he wasn't able to stay awake the whole time. He fell asleep, and when he falls asleep, the bread gets moldy, right? So he's like, yeah, man, I can't give you the secret. You can't even stay awake for a week, right? And Gilgamesh he doesn't know what to do. And Utnapishtim's wife is like, honey, yeah, Gilgamesh, if there's a plant at the bottom of the sea that you got to go get, right? And Utnapishtim's like, what? Why did you do that? Right? And Gilgamesh is like, bet, right? Ties rocks on his feet and then like walks into the ocean until he finds this plant, right? So he finds the plant that grants the person who has it or eats it or whatever immortality. Right? He gets it. He comes out. He feels like $1 million, right? Like he's done all these impossible tasks. He's done exactly what he came to do. And he's like, you know what I need? A shower, right? So he takes a bath in this well. And while he's taking a bath, a serpent, a snake, comes and it steals the plant. And it slithers away, and Gilgamesh is devastated. I mean, just absolutely devastated. I mean, think about working so hard for something and then having it robbed from you the second you get it, right? Like how crushing the weight of that disappointment, right? So apparently there was like Gilgamesh can't like go back to the bottom of the ocean and get another one. Like that was it, right? The gods granted Utnapishtim immortality, but the only other way, unless the gods grant it, is for this particular plant, right, to be found, right? So Gilgamesh has lost that, and he's like, son of a fuck. And he gets back in the boat. And Ernest takes him back to Uruk, right? Where what he finds there, right? Like and at that point, at the moment that the serpent steals the plant of immortality, we see that Gilgamesh is no longer the same person that he was when he initially set off on the journey. And in the conflict that he had with Enkidu at the beginning, and especially his attitude towards himself at the beginning is now, I mean, he's done like a total 180, right? He's a completely different person with a completely different set of perspectives as a result of all the human things that he's experienced, right? And that's the thing, right? That's significant since you're writing this down. that's the part that's really significant, is that the journey of Gilgamesh is not as important for what he learns about himself as much as it is that what he learns about himself is powerful because of his humanity, right? So that the things that he experiences, the conflict, the rejection, the disappointment, the grief, the loss, right? The having a strong friendship and that being destroyed, right? And like all of these things that Gilgamesh experiences through the context of his journey, these events and circumstances, and his choices and consequences actually reveal that the strongest part of Gilgamesh and who he is actually the third of him that's human, right? That becomes really important because the Gilgamesh at the end, man, that is someone that I can relate to. I can relate to the rejection. I can relate to the grief. I can relate to the loss. I can relate to the disappointment, the failures, the all of the things that brought humility to Gilgamesh's pride are all the human things that make us who we are and shape our outlooks, right? And so that's why we can't really relate to him at the beginning, but through the course of the narrative, we start to see that the third of him that's human, man, it is extremely human, and we can much more easily relate to that. At the very end of the text, right, there's the section at the very end, right, is entitled the death of Gilgamesh, right, and because he's 1/3 human, he is, ultimately mortal, right, and Gilgamesh's ability to live forever actually has to do with living on in the memories of and in the legends of his acts, his journey, his the choices that he made that shaped his new perspectives, right? And when he returns to Uruk, what he finds is that the people forgive him, right? The people forgive him and they celebrate him and they praise him because he has what he has now, what he didn't before, right? Which is humility, right? Which is humanity, right? And when we are more human, when we recognize our humanity and the humanity of others, we have a tendency to treat people better, right? And so Gilgamesh, as he returns, is no longer the tyrant that he was when he left, right? The god Enlil who unleashed the flood, on humanity is the one who ultimately declares that Gilgamesh will be remembered longer than any other person, longer than any other man, right? And so they praise him at the very end for being a faithful servant of the gods and being the king, that they needed. And so that's how the text ends. All right. So ultimately, we can start to understand why those concepts that we talked about, a couple of weeks ago, pride, egotism, humility, and then conflict, and then civilization versus nature, and immortality versus mortality, how all of those conflicts and those thematic concepts really lead us into a deeper understanding of who people really are, right? Who we ourselves can be as a result of experiencing loss, experiencing the death of someone that we love and respect, experiencing, disappointment at the end of a difficult task, right? It's not as difficult and it's not as powerful when it's an easy task that doesn't work out, right? But something we give our energy and our effort to, and that cost us sacrificially something of ourselves. Those are the things that have a tendency to create the deepest impact on us and to teach us the biggest lessons, right? And so that is the bird's eye view of the Epic of Gilgamesh.